Of the modern opening. We have 5 games today, but I wanted to start off. Basically, it's an analysis of the modern opening. The modern opening is something that comes into play a lot. It basically doesn't always come out of e4 g6. It can basically come out of e4 g6, e4 d6. But basically, I think when you're kind of assessing the modern opening, it has more to do with the general principles that Black follows as opposed to a specific move order. Basically, white will end up with a big center, and black will end up in a situation where he's trying to kind of develop in a relatively close position, and end up with a strong pawn break, either e5 or c5 usually, in order to disrupt the large center for white. If white overextends, this can be a problem. Basically, the whole point of modern is to hope for an overextension by white. And basically the idea there is to try to on an overextension by white, basically have a quick break and a quick recovery for black, in which he gets back the space, basically the space advantage that he's given up and the center control that he's given up. So yeah, no. It's a little bit different today. I have a class that starts at 6:30 today, so I'll have to be done by then. But I'm kind of curious to see how this goes. I'm gonna have this class on Mondays and Wednesdays at 6:30 from now now for the next probably 4 or 5 months or so. So yeah, I'm gonna have to figure out sort of what to do in terms of scheduling the stream. But yeah, I think the schedule of the stream is going to have to change just because of the way that my class schedule is going. Yeah, welcome, Amet. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Yeah, thank you for being here as well, Aphelion. Thanks everyone who's here. Anyways, this e4 d6, d4 g6, knight c3, knight f6. Basically, this is going to lead to white having an early space advantage, an early center control advantage, and an ability for white to develop his pawns more smoothly. In terms of advancing this, black will have to work with a space disadvantage. This is the modern or the perk. I mean, it's basically, the modern and the perk are kind of similar openings. Usually what makes them modern, or usually what makes the perk specifically is the knight to f6, but I consider these to basically be the same opening, the modern and the perk. They're both openings with flank development, flank pawns moving like d6 and g6, and moves like bishop to g7, bishop to d7, knight to c6. So yeah, so this is technically called the perk after knight f6, but it had been the modern until knight f6 was played. If you play something like knight c6, I think this will stay the modern. Yeah, or bishop to d7, still the modern, or bishop to g7, still the modern. On here, if it's bishop to g7, knight f3, knight f6, I think it turns back into the perk. So the defining move here is the perk comes with knight to f6, and the modern comes without knight to f6. Overall, they're both kind of interesting. They have relatively limited difference in my mind. I just view them as flank openings. Perk, modern, I use them pretty similarly, but the perk is defined by black bringing out the knight to f6. Anyways, there's a bunch of different choices. Yeah. I have a class that starts at 6:30, so I'm gonna have to adjust my schedule, I think. But we'll figure it out. So today it's gonna be at 5, and Wednesday it's gonna be at 5. And then I'll see if I'm going to be able to shift it going forward. But yeah, this 6 o'clock schedule is going to change because of the next class that I'm taking. Anyways, so this basically involves white getting a big center. There can be centers that involve f4, like this, this type of thing. There can be centers with f4, knight f3, and bishop to b3. And basically just, the main characteristic against both the perk and the modern is that, black is going to end up with this kind of closed development, moves like bishop g7, knight c6, bishop d7, and general pressure from white on the center. The risk that happens, and kind of the theme that I wanted to focus on this small segment, is what happens if white overextends. So I've looked through a few different games in which white overextended. Moves that involve overextension tend to be things like e5. If there's e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, king takes d1, knight to g4, for example, this is a pretty questionable position for white. This center control for white is way more fractured than if there had been no e5 played. Here, basically, there's the threat on f2 from the knight, but black can also do things like f6 to undermine this pawn center further. If black plays things like f6, white may have his central neutralized completely. So overall, this is kind of interesting, and a demonstration of what happens. E5 is just too early here. Knight f3 is 90 something percent move. E5 is a 3 or 4% move, and with e5, this center gets neutralized. There's a few different ways that black can play this. White can really keep pushing it with that, but overall, these lines tend to be relatively good for black. Like this is an example. So this is an example where basically it's the perk. White plays e5, the knight plays to d7, and white plays e6. So this, I would say, is overextension for white. I mean, it's a sacrificed pawn, but it's still in the opening book. It's just an overextension related opening. Knight f3, c5, knight g5, and basically white's center is almost gone here. If black plays knight to c6, or even if black... So basically, black will have to worry about this e6 pawn for another move. So say knight f8. D takes c5, and then d5. But white's center is just completely gone here. This was an overextension. E5 was an overextension. E6 was a bigger overextension. And now white has no center. So basically, overall, a good position for black versus white. Threats on c3, but this pawn center, which had been so formidable at d4, e4, and f4, is now basically disorganized and able to be kind of taken. Anyways, bishop d7, castles, queen a5, bishop takes, knight takes, and basically here black's doing just fine. This center hasn't held. I don't know. There might be a better tactical opportunity for black here, but basically this would be an example of overextension, where at the beginning of this opening, white had a full, basically a full opening where these pawns were organized, having a lot of center control. Through this overextension with e5, this center basically collapsed. Black can also try to break the center if it gets overextended with something like c5. Here, e takes d6, castles, d takes e7, for example, queen takes, bishop e2. But basically, this center is just gone for white. So really, it's the overstepping that kills white in this opening. That can usually takes place as an early e5. I think white's best opportunity here is to just hold this large center and develop his pieces around it. So moves like bishop to d3, bishop to c4, bishop to e3, h3. This all tends to be, relatively standard, more conservative, modern type play, and I think it's a lot sounder for white. If there ends up being, if e5 ends up being played, you're immediately trading off one of these three pawns for this d6 pawn, and you're probably making the other two pawns more vulnerable to attack. So this is an example of overextension in the modern or in the perk, and there's many examples of this. Some theories more kind of focused on this than others. If we look at like, I'm just going to come up with something that's sort of more slow for white. But say, bishop g7, d4, knight f6, bishop d3, castles. There's many opportunities here for white to become overdeveloped, overextended, usually with e5. So here, d takes e5, d takes e5, knight d5, and already this pawn center is way worse than it had been when the pawns were in alignment on d4, e4, and f4. This is just kind of junky. I don't know. Basically, if black wants to start an attack, he will be able to. Whereas white's going to have kind of a difficult time holding on to these pawns. Black's going to play moves like bishop to g4. Black's going to have the ability to play f6 at some point, probably after king to h8. But white's not going to hold this pawn on f4 or this pawn on e5 for the rest of the game. These pawns are very likely to fall. So Yeah, basically, a more sound strategy against the perk in the modern is to just come up with development. So in this opening, as opposed to other ones, we're just going to develop the pieces and play kind of the natural developing moves. And I'm going to bet that this turns out in a better situation. Here you probably here if black challenges you with a with a an aggressive e5 break, you can play something like d5 probably. Both F takes and D takes are in the opening book. I prefer F takes, trading this, F pawn for this D pawn. Then you can play D5. But this is a much more controlled kind of establishment of the center for white in the modern. There's much less there in terms of opportunities for attack, and as a result, this center stays there. E4 is there, D5 is there, and white's looking just fine. So knight d4, bishop e2, bishop takes, c6. But overall here, I just sort of generally like white's position. I mean, basically, white has gotten better development. He's going to be able to challenge in the center, and he's never overextended, which is a big part of this. There are positions that come out of the modern or the perk where white's going to have better attacking chances against the black king side. This is kind of a quiet line. This was a quiet way for white to develop after everything. But overall, I think this ended up being pretty solid. Let's look more at kind of more conservative perk lines. But here, knight f3, castles, bishop c4. You have to watch the e4 pawn, I guess. So say bishop to d3 instead. Knight to c6, h3, and really here white has better chances. There's opportunities here with early attacks. Basically h4, h5 can be played sometimes. You have to make sure that you play it without hanging any pawns, but it can be an effective thing to break through the king side. Probably bishop e3 I like. Knight to g4 can be played. Bishop to g1. Eventually, black will have some type of break there, but you can play moves like d5 and never have the central neutralized, maintain this kind of good center, good pawn structure for white, and not about, basically not about black regaining center control. There are shortcomings in white's position, but they're not related to, black's control of the center. This center structure sort of is the mirror image of the French center structure, and it's somewhat difficult for black to undermine it. F5 or something has to be played, and F5 really weakens the king safety. Here in this position, where you've played kind of a more conservative modern, I'd play something like queen to d2, then castles, and then basically black will be under a lot of pressure with this kind of pressing center position for white. White will be able to develop his pieces to relatively natural squares after this, things like bishop to b5. It's probably the best square for this light squared bishop now. The bishop's, I don't know, I guess h3, and then the bishop's probably going to go to e3. But overall here, I like white's position. This looks solid. And yeah, I think white's, white's sailing, white's smooth sailing for white. This is no issue. H4, c5, an early c5 is a thematic pawn break in the modern. But overall, the point that I'm making is, don't overpress the center pawns in the modern. The quiet moves, the knight f3, bishop to d3, h3, bishop to e3, queen to d2. Those modern openings are a better way to play it. E5, and you're likely to trade off pawns, and you're likely for white's big pawn center to get neutralized, and for black to be able to regain the center with moves like c5 at the right time. c5, knight c6, bishop to d7. All of those moves end up basically, offsetting white's early advantage in the center. You want to make sure that this center control and this space advantage for white stays as permanent as possible. If it doesn't, if it basically doesn't stay there, then, what value did it have? If it's just something that shows up for 6 moves and then it gets neutralized, white hasn't really won in the center. Anyways, interesting stuff. We can do a lot of work with the modern. The modern is interesting. I've tried it as black and have never been able to really get it to work. Offering opponents early advantages in space and center control, and hoping that they misplay is kind of a, in my mind, is kind of a risky strategy. You're sort of hoping for a misplay, and you'd way rather just play soundly. But it's an opening that exists, and learning how to beat it, I think, is useful because a lot of people do play it as black. All right, here is Subban's game. Subban plays the London system. I like the London system a lot. I think it's very, basically very solid, tough to beat as black, and objectively indicated to be very good. Black plays f6. So f6 I don't think is going to be a playable move. It's not in the opening book. If you look at the opening book, nowhere in here is f6. And it moves the eval by more than half a point against black. So the combination of those two factors, basically not in the opening book in a commonly played position, and moves the eval more than half a point towards your opponent. That makes it flagged for removal under our under our evaluation system as black. Just based on the eval metrics that we came up with. We have done some king and pawn end games. King and pawn end games were yesterday. Yesterday at definitely during the 10 a.m. stream, and I think during the 6:05 p.m. stream as well. If you want to keep, the thing is, I'm happy to keep going through them. Like if you want to see more king and pawn end games, you can just recommend them, and we'll go through more and more positions out of basic chess end games. Maybe I'll start off the stream going forward with something out of basic chess end games. I do think it's a good idea to do things that everyone can take a look at, not just the person who's watching the game, or not only the person whose game it is, but just more general material. I might switch things around. Maybe I'll just take maybe I'll just take a better look at it. How do you play against the London system? London system is tricky. Basically, the idea of the London system is that you're going to have to, you're going to have to play solidly. London system is one of the best, in my mind, is one of the best openings. It's one of the ones that the computer plays the most frequently. Carlsen plays it. It's just a very solid opening from an objective perspective. It doesn't necessarily offer the biggest advantages for white, but it basically leads to a lasting solid positional advantage. I think the best ways to beat an opening like the modern are, I think practically speaking, I like moves like c5. c5 challenges this pawn. You can also set up a Slav or semi-Slav position. If you play c6, knight f3, e6, if you basically set up this structure is just going to be very solid. And if you're better than your opponent, basically, if you're stronger, then you can basically hold this structure, this triangle, and make sure that it doesn't have any and keep the structure for as long as possible, and subject yourself to no vulnerabilities. If you really are legitimately stronger than your opponent, then what you can do is you can basically use a solid, basically turn it into a solid positional game, and then just outplay your opponent. Get to a position where you're playing chess, and then beat them on your positional and tactical skills. That's my recommendation. So in terms of beating the London system, I think that there's not really a good solution. I mean, it's an unrefuted, very strong opening. So I wouldn't try things like f6. I think f6 isn't the right idea. If you want to play aggressively or try to throw off your opponent, you can play something like e5. But overall, you just sort of keep, your pieces developed, play in a fundamentally correct way, and outplay a potentially weaker opponent. But there's nothing specific about the opening to win against it. What if white takes your pawn? I mean, you always have queen a5. So say here on c5, pawn takes c5, then just queen a5, and I think you should have an eval advantage. Or maybe not. I don't know. I mean, my instinct to get back the pawn is queen a5. Engine says knight c6. Knight c6 prevents b4. Now probably knight a5 or queen a5. I guess you can start kind of the opposite of a queen's gambit if you'd like. This position, this is in book and keeps playing out very well for black. This open rook file is good for black, so I guess yeah, that's a good point. What I don't see pawn takes that frequently. In this opening, pawn takes is 21, and basically 21 out of 1,200 games. So it's like a 2% chance that the pawn takes on c5. And here, it's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. But on pawn takes c5, you just basically develop normally, and if white tries to defend the pawn with things like b4, then you turn it into queen's gambit accepted with the colors reversed. Play things like a5 and try to get the pawn back that way. Here a takes b4. But overall here, this is a huge eval advantage for black. Just keep this in mind. Basically, even though black is technically down a pawn here, this open rook and increased mobility on the queen side is worth way more than the pawn that you've lost. Basically, you've lost the rook pawn more or less. So the answer to that is the answer to that question is make normal developing moves, and if your opponent tries to defend the c5 pawn, then then basically play it, transpose it into something that looks like queen's gambit accepted with colors reversed. It's interesting. I never see anyone take c5. It's kind of an interesting point. But there's no reason why they can't. I see e3 here almost every time. On e3 you play like knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and basically, it will this transposes into, basically a good version of the semi-Slav for white. So a lot of kind of transposition in terms of colors here. This is the semi-Slav with the bishop outside the pawn chain. So a pretty interesting situation, actually. Anyways, f6 is not the move. The moves are c5 or knight f6. And after this, I think basically black sort of we could do Puzzle Rush. Puzzle Rush is kind of interesting. I guess I could go through and explain the tactics, but all right, I'll take that idea into consideration, Amit. Puzzle Rush is I can explain tactical puzzles to you, or I can explain calculation to you, but I don't know. I guess that's instructional. So yeah, I'll think about it, Amit. Interesting idea. Knight c6, knight e3, bishop to g4, bishop to e2, e5. Okay, so e5 is played with, or f6 played with e5 in mind is, a big play. So f takes, bishop g3, e4, bishop e2, knight f6, castles, bishop d6. And anyways, I think basically here, black is looking fine. It's a relatively equal position, and you sort of neutralized you've neutralized the dangerous things about the London opening. This is sort of this is basically equality. So I don't know. I guess in a position like this where you've sort of, you've gone through and you've turned the f6 move into an establishment of a white center. Establishment of a black center, that tends to be pretty good for black. Okay. So I think black so white is the person playing, and I think black is playing this too aggressively. E5 is disruptive, but this loses a pawn. So after that, I think that white is fine, but then white makes a big blunder. And I see this happen sometimes. This can happen in specific lines of the French, where basically the d5 pawn is hanging. But if you see a pawn like this, right, be very careful before you take it. With queen takes d5, bishop to b4 with a discovered attack of black's queen on white's queen is a playable move. So like bishop to b4 here, and then something moves to block the check, and then queen takes the queen. So what I would say to white playing this game is definitely watch out for discovered checks. I know that it's it's sometimes difficult to see. Sometimes there's multiple pieces leading to a discovery, but there's a lot of openings that kind of involve this trap pawn on d5. If the queen takes on d5, the queen gets lost. So you need to be careful about something like this, and you need to really calculate it out. In this particular case, queen takes d5, and discoveries will allow this queen to be taken by a discovered check. Knight f6 is played, and then queen d1 is played. Mate in 1 was queen f7. Here, I think you can just sort of, you're basically entering tactical play. It's complicated. And, really here, games like these are just going to come down to tactical study. You end up winning. You end up getting some great tactics in and beating your opponent pretty well. But overall, from say this moment on, it's really just about tactics. Let's take a look at this position. Let's just take this position by itself and say, what are the plans for white? What are the plans for black? So white has better center control here, and white has, there's basically big diagonals open for white into the black position. So here, I think the best idea would be something along the lines of e3, bishop c4, and then probably castles, knight c3, and some rook to d1. But if you can basically get the bishop to c4 played, as quickly as possible, you can sort of stop black from castling, and really disrupt his game from a positional perspective. Knight e4. Here I would play e3 probably. E3 is considered to be good. Queen d5 is considered to be better because it brings this mate threat on f7 back up and it forks the knight. But e3 from a positional perspective makes sense. Queen to h4, and here I'd play here you have to defend against the mate, right? So queen e2 is a possible play. I like queen f3 a little bit better here. The issue with queen e2 is it stunts your bishop development. If you play queen to f3 instead, this bishop is still free to develop to c4, which is really where you want it. You want this bishop on c4 attacking into the black king side. So queen e2 has a positional shortcoming associated with it. It's blocking in this bishop. Okay, this all makes sense. And here, just generally white's position is good, and it's tactical play, and you're going to have to play in a tactically accurate way to shut down, basically chances. In terms of corrections in this game, queen takes d4 is something to learn. Really be careful when you take hanging pawns with your queen in the opening. There are often traps, often things like bishop to b4 can be played, and this is an example of when. And then a second improvement, queen f7 was available to you here. So on queen f7, you can checkmate, and white is going to be, white wins the game. So, basically, I think I would say slow things down, do a lot of tactics prep, and both bishop to b4 on queen takes d5, and then queen f7 on knight to f6 will become more visible to you. I know we're all at different stages in kind of improving at chess, but yeah, that's the recommendation that I would make. Watch for checkmates and watch for discovered checks when you're taking pawns in the center in the opening. A lot of openings have these kind of traps, and you need to be sure that you don't fall into them. In this game, you were lucky enough your opponent didn't see the trap either, but these traps can definitely be set for you in the opening. So when you play queen takes, openings, when your queen takes a hanging pawn in the center, really make sure that it's hanging, because in this case it definitely wasn't a hanging pawn. It was a trap pawn. So anyways, thank you very much for setting the game, Subhan, and yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you. On to the next game. Okay, this is Landrom's game. Take a look. Cool. So Landrum is playing this game as black. Let's take it from his perspective. His opponent opens with the ready. You respond knight f6, which is fine. D5 makes sense. Yeah, your opponent's basically playing a flank opening with g3. You can open up d5 and basically get a good center. Yeah, I like this. This makes a lot of sense from a fundamental perspective. Your opponent's playing a flank opening, so you can take the center and advance your pawns here. Big center lead, everything's fine. And then e5, d knight d2. And here, basically, I really just like black's position. White never really made an effective challenge for the center. You have a better pawn structure that's solid. The undermining moves here are c3 and f4 for white. But c3 looks playable. F4 looks, a bunch of moves away because this knight can't really even move. So yeah, black's got center control and can develop his pieces to healthy squares because he has a space advantage and center control. Looks good. Here, I don't know. H6 doesn't really do too much. I don't think H6 is an efficient move here. It defends against bishop to G5 eventually, but knight to G5 can't be played because it's pinned, right? So I guess I'm always sort of, especially if you're planning to castle kingside, I'm always just sort of down on proactive moves, proactive defensive moves that weaken your post-castling pawns are not a good plan. H6 is good, castles queenside is good, but hold on to your basically hold on to your situation as black and continue to develop. Do something like castles queenside here or even castles kingside here, but don't play H6 if you don't need to. These types of moves of your kingside pawns should really either be done in order to attack, or they should be done, when they're necessary, when they're necessary defensive moves. But I think in general they're not a good idea to play proactively. Here, H6, cool. A6, B5, C3, but overall black looks solid. This kind of moves weren't the most efficient thing, but position looks fine. Pawn takes, knight d7, and overall here I think black's got a pretty good situation. This king has poor safety. Your king has very good safety. I mean, white can't really get in here by any metric, so you can just go h5, h4, and basically try to break open the king side here. If you want, you can play king f7 and stack the rooks on the h file, or you can play king f7 and put the rooks on h8 and g8. But overall, I think this is good. Just keep pushing as black. Seems like a good plan to me. Rook c8's probably an idea. But yeah, this is going to come down to tactical execution. But I think if you just break through on the king side, you'll win. Nice, good win. I want to go back and say, where would I have looked for efficiency improvements? H6 I think is the first one. I'm just generally not a big fan in terms of that. This seems unforced. Your bishop's defending this knight. The knight's not going to go to G5. There's more productive moves that you can do, like castles, hoping for knight e8, f5, like in a King's Indian defense structure. There's a bunch of different options that move black forward more effectively than h6. H6 with g5 in mind, I have if that's the purpose, then I feel a little bit better about it. If the goal is to break open the king side, sure, but yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't mind these moves. These seems fine. Pawn takes h4 seems like an intuitive way to advance your pawns here. The engine's not a fan of it. The engine wants you to play knight to h7 first. But Yeah, I don't know. This looks good to me. Maybe knight to e7 now. Yeah, I don't understand what the engine's getting at when it has that shift. This is probably the only game move of the game that doesn't make sense to me. Everything else sort of made sense. I mean, h6. I think in the context of playing h6 g5, I get. I don't think there's anything any problems with that. Bishop to b4. This does not really advance your attack. You're getting a great attack going. I really think that this is good. H5, h4 is going to be really dangerous and difficult for white to deal with. But bishop to b4 brings your piece out and doesn't put it into the right attacking context. Like, you basically have all of your pieces and all of your moves so far have been directed towards attacking on the king side. So moves like h5, h4 basically don't help that much. Moves other than h5, h4 don't help that much. You've advanced your attack. You've started to get your attack in place. So playing bishop to b4 doesn't really do anything. If you play like rook c8, that's an opportunity. I mean, rook c8 I think is also anti-thematic, so I'm not a huge fan of that either. But move like king f7 maybe. But either just like h5. I mean, just attack. You're attacking. The king safety's bad. This seems like an intuitive situation for black to be attacking. Hey, thanks for sending the game, Willem. I'll add it. The game I can add for basically looks like the next open games are May 19th at 6:05 p.m. Eastern. But yeah, I'll add it. Willem. Thanks for sending it. Cool. So yeah. Basically here, just play h5, h4, and continue the attack. Don't spend your time on bishop to b4. This whole conflict doesn't seem like one that benefits black much in any way. So you can just play h5, h4, and things will be good for black versus white. I mean, now you play h4. I think this allows rook to c7. I'm trying to figure out exactly what the issue on this one is. But there's a big eval shift after queen to a2. Let's figure out what it is. No, I guess it's just h4. Yeah, h4 looks good. But yeah, this goes really badly for white. So anyways, I guess, in this game, I think you got a really solid attack. Let's see that eval, yeah, 90%. That sounds about right. Accurately played game. I like the way that you got a center against a flank opening. Cool. You didn't overextend. You waited until this pawn break for you to play d5. Makes sense. And really solid ideas. H6 and G5 make sense to me. They may not objectively be the best, but I think they provide you a lot of practical compensation. And, I really am kind of nitpicking with bishop to b4. I mean, this is the only move that doesn't make sense in the context of the rest of what you're doing. If you play h6 here, or h5, h4 here, you're attacking, you're continuing an attack that you've already started. White's king safety is bad, and, you're going to get a lot of practical compensation. The engine, I guess, is saying rook to c8 first, but I mean, I guess this makes sense. I guess it makes sense to improve your rook's mobility with tempo. Like, there's no reason to not play rook c8 first. But then I would play h5, h4 the next move. But that's pretty much it. H5, h4, and yeah. Cool. So yeah, that's my recommendation for black here. Rook to c8, and then like king to f7, h5, h4, and black should be black should be in a pretty good place. This looks solid, looks good, and black will walk into the end game, or walk into the middle game with a heavy attack and probably not even have to play an end game. H5, h4 are the ideas. So anyways, I think black is playing well. Black's got kind of a good idea going here, and I think this is a well executed attack. The engine makes the case that h6 g5 was too aggressive. I think it was just fine, especially at your level. And yeah, nicely done. Very good tactical win. The only idea to change was moving your bishop out of that. Moving your bishop and directing attention away from the exposed king. But other than that, I think it was a really solidly executed attack. So, anyways, thank you very much for sending it. It was an interesting game, and appreciate it. Please send more games. Super helpful, and interesting. Good demonstration of basically way to beat the modern as black. Way to beat white's version of the modern. This is Dan Wilkins' game. Let's take a look. Dan Wilkins is playing as black. All right, Caro-Kann with g3. That's interesting. So this is far from the main line in the Caro-Kann, right? Mainline Caro-Kann, just in case anyone wants to memorize it. I'll just play it through because I think it's worth memorizing. E4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, pawn takes, knight there, bishop there, knight there, bishop there, h4, h6, knight f3, knight d7, h5, bishop h7, bishop to d3. And, the way that you've known that you've played this correctly is you take with the queen on the 10th move. This is very well-established theory. I've played this many times. It is the mainline Caro-Kann, and it is basically solid for white. So bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, white is good. G3 I don't really know against the Caro-Kann. So here, e4, c6, and then g3 is way down the list. So, here there's 81,000 games out of d4, but there's only 30 games played out of g3. I think probably this is, questionable. It doesn't fit that criteria of half a pawn difference. It's only 0.32 pawns. But usually when you see a move that's this uncommon and there's a significant eval disadvantage of playing it, it's probably not something you want to play. This doesn't have like a bad enough eval disadvantage to worry too much about it, but here g3 is a little bit passive, but playable. It's still only 0.32 worse than the main lines here, so I guess it's fine. d5, pawn takes. Now you're in some basically exchange Caro-Kann. The thing about the exchange Caro-Kann is it solves a lot of problems for black. I don't really like the exchange Caro-Kann. You're trading an e-pawn for a c-pawn is the first thing. And then you're giving black this good knight c6 square to develop too. The combination of those means that black is going to get way better development relative to his normal Caro-Kann structure. One of the things that can be really bad in the Caro-Kann is this knight on b8. But if you play Caro-Kann exchange, then this knight on b8 is knight on b8 is solid. So here I would probably play, I don't know, bishop to g2 seems thematic. That makes sense. Knight to c3 also is some thematic. So d takes, knight d7, bishop to g2. And now you're in something that's more sort of recognizable as the Caro-Kann. If you want to really transpose in the Caro-Kann, you can play d4, and then it'll just look like a Caro-Kann with the exchange on e4. But overall here, I think this is this is a better way for white to play it. Continuing on, this pawn takes d5 I think is not the right idea for white. White should just let black take the pawn on e4. E takes, bishop g2, and now white's looking fine. Yeah, sure, we can take a look at that. That's the line. That line's kind of interesting. It's basically an advanced line where black plays c5. I know it's a main line, but it's playing off of the inefficiency of e5, the inefficiency of e4, e5 against the inefficiency of c6, c5. That's an interesting opening, Willem, for sure. But yeah, bishop e6, h3. And basically, white's looking fine. Basically this ends up being a, kind of a good position for black. One of the main differentiating things between this and normal Caro-Kann is the knight on c6. That structure is just going to favor black. d3 is also probably pretty passive here. Knight c3, okay. But knight to c6, though, just having this opportunity for black makes things so much better for him. I would probably avoid, I would avoid playing the exchange Caro-Kann, so a Caro-Kann in which you take on d5 on that basis. This just solves problems for black that don't, that could be difficulties for him otherwise. Knight to c6, knight f3. Basically here, I think white's looking fine. It's kind of a complicated middle game position. I'd probably play things like, so here I would slow things down and probably go with something like, d4 is what the engine suggests. Bishop to g5 looks fine. Overall, black, I think, has better center control. Again, having this knight on c6, which helps support this pawn on e5, is just so killer for black. So yeah, I think I'm gonna go and just basically say this e takes d5 is a misstep. You probably just want to play bishop g2 and let the pawn take on e4. So yeah, by this point black has center control, and white's sort of pushing for a flank attack, but doesn't really have the right maneuvering for it. I'm not sure if this was necessary either. And I just want to check to make sure that there's nothing too surprising. But yeah, just overall a pretty dominating game by black. Let's take a look at this game from black's perspective. It all seemed to make sense for me, or to me. So let's look. Let's play it from black's perspective. This looks good. G3 is unusual. D5 is the correct response. Pawn takes, bishop G2. And I guess here I'd probably, yeah, I understand. You were saying why is, basically you were saying I don't understand the opening eval here. Fair enough. You're in a weird line. So G3 doesn't really have, established theory. So it's not like I can really provide much guidance in, oh, okay, this move is better out of theory than this other move. I think basically your opening is fine. You get strong center play, you get good development, and the fact that that e5 is good as opposed to knight c6 is the best is not something that you should be too preoccupied about. Either way, you're taking control of the center. Knight to c6, I guess this sort of goes with the concept develop as quickly as possible. But to me, those aren't really sufficiently differentiated. Any disadvantage that you're getting from playing e5, you can play knight e6 into. White's most challenging move here is d4. Here on d4, I think you just play e4, and you have this structure in the center. f3 and then f5 potentially. So yeah, but d4 can be played on knight c6 as well. I don't think there's any issue with e4, even though the computer's marking it as not as good. Yeah. So yeah, I guess. All right. So we can definitely focus on that too. But yeah, no. Thanks for helping guide me. I couldn't remember if you were wondering about the opening or the middle game, but here you're looking good. You do have a pretty well-marked advantage, right? You have basically control of the center, better development, better pieces generally, and better king safety. So black deserves a 1-point eval advantage here. That doesn't surprise me at all. That looks correct. So the question is, how do you turn this initiative into a win? Good question. I mean, not a question with an easy answer. I think your best bet. So if you take it back to this point, I'm wondering if you might be able to do something by castling queenside here. If you really want to cement an initiative, if you launch an effective attack, that's an attack that has a lot of practical compensation and attack in which your initiative is likely to be rewarded with an error. I think castling may be the best strategy for that. That's certainly a way to play it. Otherwise, Engine is talking about d4. I probably wouldn't go for that. I think h6 g5 is probably your best bet. Engine is saying d4. I'll say h6 g5 with the idea of g4, and you can really kind of cement problems on the king side. This should be attackable. It's going to require precision, but I think you can get enough pieces onto this king side that you can break through this weakened structure. I think the idea there might be like, I'm still liking the queen. I know that there was a basically an engine flag saying that don't do this, but I'm sort of like h6, g5, g4, and pressure on the king side. And then if that doesn't work, move the knight to like e8 and play f5, f4. Really a big kingside attack, I think, should work. That's a plan. It should work though. This center play in practice played out great for you. Here, e4 is a better move. Basically, you've played in the center, and now you can have your kind of decisive pawn break. E4 is going to cause some huge problems because basically you're fixing a key liability in your position, which is this backward pawn on the e file, and then you're exchanging it for an open file for your rook. This should really add to black's positional advantage. So after pawn takes pawn, then like rook takes e4. I don't know where the queen would go in that case. Probably d1. But simplifying this center-related plan, I think is. I don't know if it's correct, but you execute it very well. So yeah, overall, I don't think there's much in terms of worrying about converting this. You picked a plan different than the one I would have played, and definitely, it's definitely possible that it's better. This center, this establishment of the center attack couldn't have gone better for black. E5, good. This was kind of weird by white, that trade of the queen for the two rooks. Now I think you're really clearly better. But yeah, I don't have much issue with the way that black played this at all. Like I think this all really made a lot of sense, and it seemed like a good game to me. 83.3, I don't really even know where you're getting dinged there. It seems 83.3 is a little bit weird considering that you've only got one inaccuracy in this game. That's pretty weird, right? The engine preferred knight fg4 over rook takes a8, but that's really nitpicking. Yeah, interesting. So I guess they said you had a lot of good moves over best moves. I think black played well here. I don't see any real issues. So white plays this weird opening. You get a good position out of the Caro-Kann exchange, and I don't know. Yeah, not really much to. White definitely didn't need to play as aggressively as they did. But yeah, I guess I would say your planning here seemed to really work. This centralized attack worked. In terms of comparing it to potential for a kingside attack, that's a that's not the easiest question in the world to think about. 95 looks good. I don't know. I think you played it pretty well, Dan. I didn't really see any problems with this. Okay. Yeah, I mean, To me, it just feels like you got ahead by move 3, and then f6, sure. Knight d4, knight e4 is probably a better response to this than the knight to b1. But I don't know. No, I think you generally played in a positionally strong way. Uh, in terms of things that I would have played differently, I'm still curious about the value of this kingside attack here. So let's take it all the way back to like here, and see what would happen if black started doing things like h5 and knight g4, h6, hg5, just like general pressure on the king side here. I would have started off with castles queen side, so I'm already on questionable footing with the engine. And let's say d4, e4, and this feels good for black. Yeah. So let's look at this. So I said let's castle queen side and start an attack on the king side. The engine says that's not a great idea. That shifts the eval from +1 to -1.7. And then you actually played the line that white is, the computer's recommending. So d4, which the computer says is best, and e4, which the computer says is best. And then it's not really plus 0.17, it's minus 0.22. So yeah, that seems like fine. Knight e5 is an idea for white, but I'm liking the kingside attack here. Your king safety feels fine to me. I don't see any problem with your king safety. I want to launch an attack. Knight e5, queen to c7, and yeah, this is no worse than equal, and I think could potentially get really dangerous for white. So I'd think like h6 or g5. See g6. I might be pressing too hard on this. I mean, what you did worked fine. I thought that you might be able to make a kingside attack a bigger part of your plan. But if you go through and look through the middle game play, I think what you did was solid. There's not really much there, much improvement. Yeah, d5 I guess, or d4 I guess could be played, but yeah, I don't know. Bishop f5 was a good move. It didn't trade off the bishop for the knight. Yeah, nice. Good job. Good checkmate. So yeah, I guess I would say, basically this e5 and d5 structure looks solid. Bishop e6 looks good. Yeah, no. Thanks. Thanks, Dan. I would spend more time if I had more time for analysis, looking at potential ways that a kingside attack could evolve here. But overall, I think this just ended up working out great for black. This center control was good. And yeah, I don't know if there's too much to think about here. Overall, just white plays a weird opening. I guess, all right, if you want me to really nitpick, I guess I would play knight c6 earlier than you did. Here, I would play knight c6. Not even the first time. I think e5 is fine, but I would play knight to c6 as opposed to knight to f6. You've got this excellent, outpost for your knight now, because your opponent played the Caro-Kann exchange. So I would go with that, and play knight to c6 earlier. You played a very good game. It was accurate, made sense, no tactical errors, solid. That I think was, I think that was good. Strong, accurately played game. Bishop d2, I guess, was a little bit of mistake. And then e4, right? The computer's saying that e4 breaking open this open rook file is a little bit better. These seem pretty trivial to me, honestly. You're up pawns and you're up pieces, so don't worry about when you move. I agree with your general concept. I wouldn't worry too much about when you moved your knight to c6. E5 or e4 is a tactical improvement, but not. I don't know. You were up pawns either way. Nice. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks very much for sending the game in, Dan. I really appreciate you sending it in. Please send in more. This was overall just a really solidly played game. I wouldn't want to, I don't want to, diminish it. It just, you played accurately. You got a good win. Your opponent played some moves that allowed you to establish a lead relatively early, and you just sort of held on to the lead in a relatively efficient way. So yeah, makes sense to me. Seemed like a solid game. Yeah, I guess breaking open that e-file was the only tactical improvement that I can think of. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you for sending the game, Dan. Please keep sending games in. Solidly played. Nice game. Cool. Two more. All right, this is Sam Sejwani's game. Sam Sejwani is playing black. And let's take a look. Bishop c4, bishop c5, castles. Okay, this is interesting. So this is a book, or this is a book move, right? Basically, castles is one of the most popular moves here. But one of the good things about this early castling move in the Guaco piano, you can play d6 very early and potentially establish a very early attack on the king side. White has really committed to something here, and you can press him hard on it by playing moves like d6, bishop to g4, h5. So I recommend doing that. d6 is the move that I play here. White might play something like c3, and then I'd play like bishop to g4, like almost immediately. h3, bishop h5, and now White has to choose between d3, which will allow you to continue to attack. Here you probably play queen to d7, basically, or he needs to really open his king side up by playing g4. d3 allows you to maintain the pin. That's important. But yeah, I would play d3, or I would hold that bishop on h5 against d3. So yeah. Bishop c4, bishop c5. I play d6. Knight f6 is the mainline move here. Knight f6 is fine, but I play d6. D6 and bishop to g4 very quickly. On c3, d6 is now the most popular move. D6 is interesting here. Let's go through a d6 line. So d6, d4 is the one that I'm thinking of. Pawn takes, bishop b6, knight c3, bishop g4. I guess this plays out fine for black. I think of this as being sort of an attacking position for black, but hey, yeah, thanks. Welcome to the stream, Jack. Appreciate it. Everything's going on well here. But yeah, thanks for stopping by. Yeah, so here, castles, c3, knight f6. d3 is the most common. c3 feels early, but yeah, overall here, this position turns out fine. I think, I guess, I don't know. White seems to be consolidating his positional advantage. This could be more than I thought it was. Let's slow this down. Black looks fine. I wouldn't play knight takes e4, although it might be the preferred. Hey, welcome, Subban. Your game your game was the second or third game, so we went through it already. But you can watch it VOD if you're just getting here. But yeah, pawn takes. The engine is recommending on d4, bishop to b6. This is gonna be kind of interesting too. So pawn takes, knight g4, and then black's gonna have kind of a Budapest gambit thing going on with the e5 pawn. That's kind of unusual. Bishop f4, queen e8, and yeah, pressure on this knight, and then basically ultimately knight c takes e5. Pretty interesting. That's a line. But Yeah, I play d6. I play d6, bishop g4, and my game becomes about putting as much pressure on this pinned knight. Sometimes I play knight d4, and sometimes I play queen to f6. I'm not sure I would have played. The engine is saying knight takes e4. I'm not sure I would have played that. I probably would have played d6 here too. Let's just look at the opening theory here. I think d6 might be the most common, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, d6 is the most common move in this situation. One of the real resources for black in these types of games is the ability to play bishop to g4 and get a pin on the queen on d1. That's a big piece of this game that can really be helpful, and that's what I would recommend. Yeah, we talked about overextension against the modern today. That was what we started off with, but we already sort of finished that. Subhan. We're doing Sam Sejuani's game, and then we're doing Emmett's game, or Till Daniel Noah's game. But yeah, we started off with a good 15-minute lecture on that today. So c3, castles, d4, pawn takes d4, c takes. And here white's really established a good lead. The misstep here, I think, was probably taking. Here if you play bishop... So basically the issue with taking is that this is going to end up with white getting a solid center and black not having any resources available to disrupt it. The better play for black here is not taking. It's immediate bishop to b6, and then on pawn e5 to d4, and basically continued threats along this this pawn on e5. Basically, white won't be able to hold this long term. Black's going to get too many pieces on it. So queen e7, knight rook e8, and pressure's going to be on the e5 pawn. So overall, that's what I think what black should be shooting for. After bishop, hey, thank you very much for the follow, Alan. I appreciate it. Thank you. So after basically after pawn takes, black's showing a pretty rough eval, and white's got a solid center that's going to be super difficult to disrupt. So yeah, bishop b6, or sorry, that bishop b6 was correct pre-trade. Pre-trade, you can get the pawn back on e5. Post-trade, you just have a positional disadvantage. The difference here is, basically the game continues on, and here you actually have a great opportunity. So, here you basically can get full equality if you play a two-move tactic. So I think recognizing these two-move tactics is extremely important. They come up all the time. So doing your tactical study, doing your puzzle study is extremely important. If you see this, your position will be way better than otherwise. The correct move here is knight takes e4, and then on rook takes d5. White has to choose between losing this pawn outright and playing something else, and then you can move your knight back to f6, or taking this knight back and then getting forked by your pawn on d5. Those are white's choices, and neither of them are particularly good. So d5 is a solid fork here. This is a good idea. Knight a5, just knight a5 is fine. It's just that you have this tactic that gets you basically gets these pieces off the board and improves your position. So this is a tactic that I think you should you will be able to see after enough tactical study. d5 forks these two, awesome. And then black is basically equalized. After bishop to b3, black is equalized too. You can just play knight takes b3, and you've traded a knight for white's good squared bishop. That's good. c6, basically is an error, or c6 is not, it's not taking the bishop. White doesn't move the bishop, which he should, and you're just continuing to have these threats on b3. The engine, basically, I'm sort of, if you weren't interested in taking the bishop on b3, then that sort of makes knight to a5 a little bit silly. Knight to a5 is where you wanted that, the usefulness of knight to a5 was to take the bishop. So if you have the opportunity to take the bishop, you should with the knight. The knight is worth less than white's good squared bishop, especially in the Guaco Piano or Italian game. Rui Lopez. This is one of the key pieces in the white's position. So if you play knight takes ace3, knight takes b3 here, you're trading a mediocre knight for a good bishop. So you should take. Okay, this all looks good. And yeah, I think from this point, the position's about equal. Black has the better minor pieces. Black has the better pawn structure. You probably just want to trade off and just to neutralize this attack. But this gets dangerous. So, here what the engine is suggesting, and I agree, queen to c8 to threaten the queen on g4. If you can take off your knight or your queen versus your opponent's queen, you'll be in a good place. So I would just do that and hope for a relatively early endgame. c5 opens up too many opportunities. C takes d4 is great, good tactical idea. And here with king to h8, you're safe. Rook to f3, and basically you're in some pretty brutal, tactical play in this late game. But the things that I would talk about in terms of going through this game, where can black improve? The first thing is don't trade this pawn. You're in some kind of tricky theory, but you basically do much better as black here if you play bishop to b6, pawn takes e5, and knight to g4. So just keep that in mind. That's a better way to play as black. Play to win back e5. You will successfully win back e5, and with e5 having been removed from the board, black will have a good position. Queen e8. Okay, sure. But with this, white just has a large solidified center. So basically, with rook e1, you have this tactic: knight takes, rook takes, d5. This is better for black. On knight a5, the bishop moves to b3, and you should still take it because this knight is better than this light squared bishop for white. So just trade it off. This it's a good trade for you. Just trade off the knight and continue on with undermining white center. If you weren't interested in taking the bishop, you probably the knight a5 doesn't make much sense as a move. Okay, this all looks good. And then basically this gets pretty dangerous. Into this position, into this late middle game, you've got a slightly better position as black. Your minor pieces are better. You're gonna have opportunities to post your knight potentially on c4, and really your only shortcoming is this king safety. So you need to kind of adjust your position to get good king safety. The computer does it in a perfectly efficient way. Queen to g5. That's pretty great. Basically, this forces the queen off, or it forces you to take on d4. The opposite, but yes, that is the rule. So if you're up material, trade off pieces. If you're down material, trade off pawns. Yeah, it's the other way around. Because the main point is that if you trade off all your pawns and then you are say for example you're down a minor piece, you want to trade off all the pawns, because if you can get your opponent into a situation in which they only have a king and minor piece left, that is that's an improvement. Basically you can force a draw against a king and minor piece if you trade off all the pawns. So you should be trading off pawns if you're down material, with the idea that your opponent's not going to be able to mate you if they wind up with a king and knight, or a king and bishop, or probably a king, bishop, and knight. So trade off the pieces if you're up, but keep the pawns on because you'll need to promote them. And then for exactly the same reason, if you're down material, trade off all the pawns, because if you end up having to sacrifice, a minor piece for a pawn, or if you end up having to sacrifice a minor piece for your opponent's last pawn, that will probably lead to a draw. But yeah, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. I think that generally holds true. Yeah, I think that's pretty safe. That's a pretty safe truth. Yeah. So here, neither side is up material, but your main liability here is your king safety. So if you can stop white's attack, you'll equalize in a pretty serious way. Queen g5 is the best way to really stop white's attack from advancing any further. So I recommend that you play that. Basically after queen takes g5, rook takes g5, now there's an open e-file, but nothing too terrible. So overall, black's looking fine. Anyways, improvements from front to back. Okay, this is the, I played an earlier d6 than you do, but that's fine. And then here, the way to equalize materially and hold on to a better position is to just make white take your e5 pawn. Here, after pawn takes e5, knight to g4, and then you'll have backwards threats to take back e5. And in this case, white won't establish the same big center that he does if you just trade off and play bishop to b6. So this is a way better. This is actually a way better outcome for black. Anyways, you get into this position, and you should trade off your knight for that light squared bishop. It's just a good trade in terms of material. Like white's good squared bishop on a good diagonal versus your knight. It's a good trade. So trade off your knight for the bishop. And then why not take knight takes e4? Yeah, right. No, exactly. So that's and that's another improvement. So knight takes e4 here, rook takes e4, d5. Yeah, we looked at that a bit. But this this fork is also very good for black. This will lead to black ending up with a pawn on c4. So overall, yes, this is also another improvement on the game. So I would recommend going for, I would recommend studying like the two-move tactics so that you always see this. But yeah, that's another one. And then, but here for a number of moves, you could play knight takes b3 pretty safely. So I think that you should. And then here, really the only thing that can really, hurt your position as black here is a kingside attack. Your main liability here is, you've better minor pieces and better pawn structure. So the really only dangerous thing for you as black is the queen on g4, and with queen to g5, you effectively shut that down. Then there's a lot of tactics. I don't really want to get too into that because I think they're, you can sort of look at the engine for small tactical improvements, but yeah, conceptually you should take this opportunity here on move 18 to play queen g5 and trade down. That's a big deal. And if you trade off, if you trade off here, that's going to be good for you. You're going to wind up in a situation in which you're facing off with better pieces against a worse pawn structure. Should be a win for black. Anyways, very interesting position, very interesting game, yeah, I'm glad you won. You got out of this tactical mess very successfully, so good tactical play to get out of it. Yeah, but yeah, I think like all of us, I think you would it's an efficient idea for you to do some more tactical study. It's an efficient idea for me to do more tactical study. So I think that's a good step forward, and I think if you do that, it's going to pay off well for you, Sam Sejwani. Thank you very much for sending the game, and please keep sending them. I really appreciate it. It makes life so much better to have a bunch of games to draw from. So yeah, I really appreciate you participating in the stream and for sending the game over. And then we have one more. It's from Till Daniel Noah. I don't know if he's here, but in any case, we'll take it from his perspective. Cool. Yeah, thanks. I always get everyone's names confused. So yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jack. But yeah, so let's take a look. You play the Caro-Kann. Cool. Well, yeah, that's what I was wondering. You have 3 different ones for Twitch, chess, and but I mean it's cool. It's cool. It's a good exercise for me. I'm just not perfect at remembering. So yeah. So here, F3 is kind of an interesting move. This is the fantasy variation. Okay, cool. I didn't really know the, yeah, interesting. I didn't know that this is what that was called. So someone said fantasy variation earlier. I thought I knew what that was and was wrong. So this is the fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann, the one where white plays f3. Anyways, black plays e6. That's the most common. And white's up by about a pawn. Cool. And overall, how should black sort of advance this position? I think I basically like black's position. I think it's a good idea to not trade off pawns, and I think it's a good idea to hold on to this structure. Interesting. Yeah, so cool. All right, interesting. I didn't know why that was called, and I think basically, if you just hold the pawn structure as is, you can end up in a good situation as black. I think basically what you do is you play this like a semi-Slav, and don't make any real errors. Ideas like knight e7, knight g6, ideas like bishop e7, ideas like knight d7, knight b6, all of those I think are good for, I think all of those are good for black. And it's really just going to become about, developing your material in kind of a sound and reasonable way. Good stuff. Here, the engine is recommending d takes e4. I would not play d takes e4. I'm in disagreement with the engine here. I think you've got a good semi-Slav structure. It's not going to get attacked very easily, and you can develop in a healthy way with that structure. Ideas I would make white take your d5 pawn, and then retake with the e pawn, and then free your bishop that way. So knight f6, h6. This all looks fine, to be honest. Yeah, no. I mean, the thing is, it is objectively the best move here. So after e6, bishop d3, I'm sure that d takes e4 is considered to be the most. So after f3, e6 is the most common. I like it. I like e6 though. Just get the semi-Slav structure, turn it into something solid. White's got kind of awkward pieces. Like, among other things, this f3 should be a problem for white. He's not going to be able to play queen f3, knight f3, or anything else. So yeah, I just like black's position from a solid perspective. I wouldn't take e4 even if the engine says that's best, and I would play like, knight e7, knight g6, bishop e7, and just just play solidly. There's no reason to push too hard as black. I think ideas like queen b6 could be good. I like this. I like this fine as black. The engine is still pushing for takes e4, but I think it's just why disrupt this good pawn structure? You're developing fine. You're developing in a natural way. If you want to break the pawn structure, I would do it with c5 and not pawn takes e4. But yeah, overall I'm sort of thematically disagreeing. So here, I guess here I would probably play c5. Yeah, so c5 is the move that I would play. You are probably going to need to open this up at some point. But c5 keeps your pawn structure completely intact. You're not getting rid of the leading d pawn. You're getting rid of this c pawn, which is providing kind of redundant defense. c5, if pawn takes, you've got the choice of whether to take on e5 or c5, but you're in a better position as black for sure. So I would play c5. I know this isn't the developing move, but just in in the sense of challenging white on his basically challenging white on his d4 square, this is a better move. The one thing I will say about this is that basically kind of a lesson that I'm using here is one from Ideas Behind the Chess Openings. Yeah, exactly right, Jack. And that's just what I was going to say. So I'm drawing from Ideas Behind the Chess Openings. What you basically have here is actually the French structure. It's interesting how they sort of transpose into each other, but this semi-Slav actually turns into the French with c5. And in this French structure, c5 is a very valuable resource in disrupting the important d4 and e5 pawns. So this c5, which wrecks those pawns, is a good idea. So here, you may get the opportunity to I think it's a really good book. I think it's an old one. It's by Reuben Fine, but it's an old book that reads very well and just talks about it talks about very big general concepts and openings without getting into too much detail. It's super easy to read, and you don't have to like play it in front of the board or do anything too crazy with it. I really like that one. I draw on it all the time for understanding of openings or understanding of pawn structures. And this is an example where it's really useful. Because, if you know that opening and you know basically the French is supposed to have the d4 and e5 pawns, maintained by white for the whole game, you know for a fact that you aren't supposed to play pawn takes c5. So when pawn takes c5 gets played, you know that this is going to turn into a favorable French line. That's why this book is so valuable. It's got a specific section in it where it talks about the French, and it basically gives like 6 diagrams of different French structures that you can look at. And and this is, basically the ones that are the best for white are the ones where these pawns are maintained on d4 and e5, and the potential undermining pawn moves, which are usually f6 and c5, are gone for black. So that's the value of that book, is it just gives a really good general view without talking too much about technicals. So yeah, anyways, really solid one. Yeah, totally. No, it's really good. There's this one page in particular that illustrates all the different relative strengths of pawn structures in French opening. I draw on that all the time when I'm thinking of openings. So here, c5. Yes, definitely. Yep, it's old. I think it's in at least the version is in descriptive notation. One of the things I sort of like is that a lot of these books are common domain. Check for sure. But some of them you can even find online sometimes because they're like, they're so old. They're like written in the 1920s. So you can actually find free legal copies online just because they're outside of copyright protection. Just something to think about. This one I'm not sure if it is or it isn't, but I actually like looking at old books because they have not hijacked copies. It's just in the public domain at this point. Yeah. Anyways, just something to think about. I don't know if you can. I mean, but these ones you can legally find online, Willem, and that's a very key part of my assessment. I would never advocate anything that isn't legal. So, I think the fact that they are common domain and you can legally get shared copies of them online is a key point of this. Yeah. So c5. White should defend with c3. Exactly right. So white should defend with c3 to maintain the pawns on d4 and e5. And you know this from the French book. All right, I've been a little bit slow here, and I'm gonna have to speed up, unfortunately. White manages to get a fairly solid lead. Just sorry, guys, because I have my class at 6:30. These seem like these are basically tactical considerations. Tactics trainers will make you play these efficiently as possible. In terms of looking at this game, I like the way that you played this. I think holding on to this semi-Slav structure is a perfectly fine idea. The way to break this structure is not with pawn takes e4, it's with c5. This is, I think, what you do, right? Yeah, so you do that eventually. I would do it even earlier. Like I would play c5 as opposed to bishop to b4 here. Queen to b6, it gets a little bit tricky. Queen to b6 is a tactical error because of b4. Basically this bishop gets stuck on a5 on b4. So that's a small improvement for black. And then I think there's just a lot of sort of volatility. So yeah, I think it was a good game. I think you really played the opening in an intuitive way. Ideas behind the chess openings is very helpful for understanding opening pawn structures. And also I think that in general, once it becomes a tactically complicated position, it really becomes reliant on how much tactical study you've done. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap up this one early. I sort of I wish I could give it more time, but I literally have a class starting in 1 minute. I please send more. No, please send more games. I'm sorry that I had to go through that one a little faster than I would have liked to. And thank you all very much for being here, and thank you very much for sending games to the stream. I really appreciate it. Yeah, very, very, very happy to see you guys here. Next stream is at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, and tomorrow will be a normal schedule with a class at 6:05 p.m. Thanks, guys. Have a good night. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Bye.